wanted just a cook at ranch. But a widow came with a daughter and set his empty nights on fire. Under the blazing desert sky, his nights had been nothing but silence, yet her arrival carried a spark that threatened to burn through the loneliness he had worn like armor. Love was never what he had asked for, but it was already at his doorstep, wrapped in dust and shadows. The sun in. The New Mexico territory had no mercy that afternoon of 1890. It scorched the land and pressed its heat into the timber. Walls of Garrick Hale's ranch until they seemed to groan with the weight of it. Dust curled in lazy spirals across the dry earth, and a single sheet of paper flapped against the post by the front gate. In bold, plain letters it read, "Need a cook." It was not a plea, only a fact. Garrick was a man who did not dress his words in frills. He wanted someone to prepare meals, nothing more. From the porch, he stood tall, weather-beaten, his frame carved by years of ranch labor and solitude. 37 years had hardened him into silence more than speech. He remembered the laughter that had once filled the same porch when his wife was alive, remembered how her voice could soften the sharpest edges of the world. That laughter had been stolen in a moment of violence, and since then the house had grown hollow. He had grown hollow. The paper nailed to the gate was supposed to solve only hunger and practicality, not the emptiness. It was nearly forgotten by the time he heard footsteps crunching down the road. Garrick narrowed his eyes against the glare and saw a figure approach, leading something smaller beside her. A woman, her dress frayed at the hem, patches worn thin by hard travel, her face pale under the weight of the sun. In her right hand, she carried a rough sack slung over her shoulder, and with her left she guided a child, small, blonde-haired, no older than 7, her braids loose, clinging to her mother's hand with both trust and fear. The woman paused at the gate. Dust clung to her lashes, her lips dry but firm. Garrick studied her, noting the dignity that managed to survive beneath the exhaustion. Her eyes were striking, not timid, not pleading, but steady like storm clouds holding back thunder. She said nothing at first, only lifted her chin and gestured at the paper tacked to the post. "You posted for a cook," she said, her voice low and even. Garrick did not speak quickly. He let the silence breathe before he gave a single nod. "I can cook," she continued, "and I can work. I've nowhere else to take my daughter." She didn't beg, didn't explain further. The words carried weight like iron, plain, unapologetic, yet heavy with what remained unsaid. Garrick's gaze dropped to the child beside her. The little girl's eyes were wide and wary, though not without brightness. She held her mother's hand tightly, but her other hand clutched a small cloth doll worn down to its seams. Garrick saw the hunger in her cheeks, the dust in her hair, the miles etched into both their faces. He stepped down from the porch, boots striking the ground with deliberate weight. For a long moment the three of them stood in the hot silence, the only sound the restless flap of the paper on the post. Finally Garrick's voice broke through, rough from disuse. "Come inside. We'll talk over coffee." The woman gave one curt nod, relief flickering across her face, though she did not let it soften her. She led her daughter forward, and as they passed him, Garrick caught the faint scent of soap and dust, a smell not unpleasant but raw, honest. For the first time in years he closed the door behind someone who was not himself. The house was spare, its wooden beams stripped of warmth, its hearth cold except for ash. The kitchen table bore the scars of 1,000 meals and 100 memories, none recent. Garrick poured 2 cups of coffee, set one across from the other, and motioned for her to sit. The child clung to her mother's dress, watching Garrick as if he were some creature to be measured. The woman wrapped her fingers around the cup. Her hands were rough, not delicate, the skin across her knuckles raw from work. She sipped and swallowed as though the warmth burned and healed at once. "What's your name?" Garrick asked. "Marin Dusk," she replied, steady again. "My daughter's name is Elora." Elora peeked at him from behind her mother's arm, clutching her doll close, her expression one of curiosity fighting with fear. Garrick inclined his head to her but asked nothing more. "You've cooked?" he asked finally. Marin gave the faintest of smiles, though it did not reach her eyes. "Cooked, cleaned, mended, whatever was asked of me. Hunger teaches you quickly. Grief teaches you faster." The words lingered in the air between them. Garrick did not press. He knew the shape of grief too well to carve it open for show. He only nodded, sipping from his own cup. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It was thick, weighted with a strange awareness neither of them named. Elora had climbed onto a chair by then, small legs swinging as she stared at the cracks in the wooden floor. "You'll have your own room," Garrick said at last, his tone even. "Food provided. You'll be paid weekly. And my daughter." Marin's question was firm, protective. She stays, he answered. Her shoulders eased just slightly, but her eyes stayed locked on his, testing, measuring. When she saw no shift in his expression, no hesitation, she nodded once more. By evening, the sound of a knife against a cutting board filled the kitchen. The scent of onions and beans, simmering with a trace of smoked meat, drifted through the house. Marin moved with quiet efficiency, finding pots and utensils as if the kitchen belonged to her. Garrick stood in the doorway, watching her shoulders shift under the faded dress, her braids sliding forward as she leaned over the stove. He did not step closer, but he did not look away. Elora sat at the table, humming softly to her doll, a sound that felt startling in the barren silence Garrick had grown used to. For the first time in too long, the house felt less like a monument to loss and more like something living. That night, as the three of them ate together, Garrick said little. Marin's cooking was simple but warm, filling in a way that spoke of care. Elora ate eagerly, crumbs clinging to her chin, and Marin brushed them away with gentle patience. Garrick's eyes lingered on the gesture, remembering hands once gentle in the same kitchen, and for a flicker of a second, the ache in his chest softened. After supper, when the table was cleared and Elora tucked onto a cot in the adjoining room, Garrick stepped outside. The sky stretched wide, stars pressing against the horizon, sharp against the black. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the porch rail, listening to the faint clatter of dishes from within. The screen door creaked, and Marin stepped out quietly. She held her shawl tight around her shoulders, the cool night air brushing strands of hair loose from her braid. She did not ask permission to join him. She simply leaned against the post a few feet away, eyes turned to the sky. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was different now, not the silence of absence but of presence. Two people aware of the nearness of another soul, yet uncertain what words could be trusted. Finally, Marin said, her voice softer than before, "I've walked far to find a place that doesn't spit me out before I've crossed the threshold." Garrick glanced at her, the glow of the lantern brushing her face, making her look both weary and unbreakable. "You found one," he said simply. She looked at him then, her eyes deep and unreadable, as though she wanted to believe him but wasn't sure if she could. Her lips parted as though to speak, but she stopped, pressing them together instead. He didn't push. The night grew cooler, stars burning brighter. Garrick dropped the cigarette to the dirt, crushed it under his boot, and for the first time in years, he did not return to a silent house alone. He returned to a house with voices, with warmth, with the faint scent of bread baking for morning, and somewhere in that quiet, in the rustle of skirts, in the sound of a child breathing in sleep, and in the steady presence of a woman who refused to bend, Garrick felt the first ember of something he thought had long been buried. It was not love yet, but it was fire, waiting to be fed. The morning came with a sky pale as bone and air that smelled faintly of dew and dust. Garrick woke to sounds he had not heard in years. Footsteps in the kitchen, the faint scrape of a chair, the clink of dishes. For so long the house had been filled with nothing but the creak of timber and his own boots on the floorboards. And now, there was rhythm. He sat up on the edge of the bed, pulling on his boots slowly, listening. Marin moved through the kitchen like she belonged there. She had found the flour, the crock of beans, the jug of milk without asking where anything was. Elora hummed a faint tune at the table, a childish melody that tangled with the rustle of dough beneath her mother's hands. Garrick walked in, silent as ever, and paused at the doorway, watching. The stove glowed with new fire, smoke rising soft and white through the chimney. Bread was already in the oven, and the skillet sizzled with slices of pork. Marin looked up at him, a strand of hair falling loose against her cheek. Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes caught his briefly, and for a second, something unspoken held between them. She turned back to the stove before he could make sense of it. "You rise early," Garrick said, his voice rough from sleep. "Work doesn't wait," Marin replied. She slid the skillet across the stove, her hands practiced, sure. Elora looked up at him then, her small mouth curling into a hesitant smile. He sat at the table, folding his hands, letting the quiet fill the space. For years, silence had meant absence, the weight of an empty room. Now it was layered with other sounds, spoon against a pot, the faint laugh of a child, the crackle of firewood. When the bread came out, golden and steaming, Garrick tore a piece, and though he did not show it, he felt warmth spread in his chest with each bite. After breakfast, Garrick left for the barn. The chores were endless, fences to mend, cattle to check, water to haul. He worked with steady precision, his muscles aching with the familiar rhythm. From the corner of his eye, he saw Laura carrying a small bucket toward the goats. She was clumsy, the bucket nearly too heavy for her small arms, but she was determined. Maren followed behind, watching her daughter, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Garrick noticed the way Maren let Alora try before helping, teaching her resilience even in small tasks. By midday, Garrick returned to the house. Maren had swept the floors, aired the linens, and set a pot to simmer on the stove. She was mending a shirt at the table, her head bent, her fingers moving quick and sure through the fabric. The lamplight caught the strands of her hair, and Garrick found himself pausing, just watching the simple act of her stitching his torn sleeve. It was not something he had asked for, but she had done it anyway. That night, the wind picked up, whistling low across the plains. Garrick sat by the fire, oil lamp casting a warm glow across the room. Maren sat across from him, mending another tear in Alora's dress while the child slept in the next room. The quiet stretched, but this time Garrick broke it. "You've traveled far," he said. His tone wasn't demanding, just steady, leaving space for her to answer or not. Maren's hands paused over the needle. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fabric. "Farther than I thought I could," she said finally. Her voice was calm, but something inside it carried a weight too deep to name. He didn't ask more, but she glanced up, meeting his eyes for just a breath before looking away again. "Some places don't welcome women like me. Some men don't either." Garrick leaned back, the leather chair creaking beneath him. "A cook is a cook. A child is a child. You'll find no quarrel here." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close. She returned to her stitching, but the air between them had shifted. Days folded into weeks. The rhythm of life on the ranch settled, though it was different now. Maren's presence softened the edges. Alora learned to carry water, to feed chickens, to sweep without being told. Garrick began to notice small things he had overlooked for years: the sound of a kettle whistling, the smell of fresh cornbread, the way laughter carried across the yard when Alora chased the hens. He didn't laugh himself, not out loud, but he felt something stir in him when he watched. One afternoon, Garrick returned from the north pasture with his hands blistered from fixing a broken fence. He entered the kitchen, his shirt damp with sweat, dust clinging to his skin. Maren looked up from the stove, saw the raw red lines across his palms. Without a word, she crossed the room, took his hands gently in hers and turned them over. Her touch was firm but careful, her brows drawn in concern. "You'll tear yourself open," she said. Her voice was quiet, but carried more reproach than he had expected. She fetched a basin of water, dipped a cloth, and began wiping the dirt away. Garrick did not move, did not pull back. He only watched her hands, the way they lingered over his skin, the way her breath caught when she pressed too hard and realized it. "You've done this before," Garrick murmured. Maren hesitated. "Tended wounds?" "Yes, life teaches you more than you want to know." Their eyes met then, and for a long moment neither looked away. The fire crackled, the kettle hissed softly, but it was the silence between them that carried the most sound. When she finally let go, her hands trembled faintly, though her face remained composed. That night, the sky turned dark and heavy, clouds rolling in thick and fast. Lightning split across the horizon and thunder shook the windows. Garrick secured the barn while Maren gathered Alora inside, wrapping her in a blanket. The child clung to her mother, wide-eyed at the roar of the storm. Garrick entered, rain dripping from his hat and shoulders. He set it aside, his shirt clinging to him, his chest heaving from the run. Maren stood near the fire, her daughter in her arms, the lamplight flickering across her face. Garrick's eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them: fear, relief, and something deeper. Alora finally drifted to sleep, her small fingers tangled in her mother's hair. Maren laid her down gently, then turned back to the fire. Garrick was already there, standing close enough that the heat lit his features, shadows carving his jaw. The storm raged outside, but the room felt still. Maren pulled her shawl tighter, but it wasn't the cold she was shielding from. Garrick's gaze held hers, and she found she could not look away. "You're strong," he said quietly, his voice nearly drowned by thunder. Maren shook her head faintly. "I only keep moving. If I stop, I fall." "You've not fallen yet," he answered. Her lips parted, her breath catching in her throat. She looked into his eyes, saw the weariness, the scars, but also something steadier, something she had not seen in a man for years: gentleness beneath the steel. For a heartbeat too long, the world outside seemed to vanish. The firelight flickered, casting gold across her face, across his. She turned away before the moment could become something more, but her hands trembled as she set the shawl across her shoulders. Garrick stayed still, watching her, saying nothing. When the storm finally broke and silence fell heavy again, the house carried a new weight. The kind that could not be explained in words, only in the space between them. Garrick went to his room, but he did not sleep. Maren lay awake beside her daughter, her heart beating too fast, not from fear of the storm, but from the memory of his eyes on hers. And though nothing had been spoken, though no promises had been made, both knew something had shifted, something they could not easily turn away from. It was not yet love, but it was no longer only survival. The days after the storm fell into a rhythm that almost felt like belonging. Garrick worked slower now, not from weakness but from caution. His thoughts more often pulled back to the house than to the farthest fences. Maren had brought something more than bread and mended shirts. She had carried warmth into walls that had known only dust. Alora laughed louder now, chasing chickens across the yard or tugging Garrick's sleeve when he came in from the fields, asking questions with eyes bright as spring. Garrick did not always answer, but he always listened, and she seemed to know that was enough. But peace is a fragile thing on the frontier. It rarely lingers without shadow. It was just past noon when Garrick returned from town with supplies. The wagon wheels crunched against gravel, and as he pulled into the yard he saw Maren and Alora waiting by the porch, smiles faint but real. Maren had tied her hair back in a loose knot, and the wind tugged strands free, setting them dancing against her cheek. For a fleeting moment, Garrick thought of what it might mean if this life, this presence, were no longer temporary. Before he could climb down, a rider appeared on the ridge. Dust rose around the hooves, a cloud that moved with purpose, carrying a figure draped in dark leather, posture too confident, too sure of himself. Garrick narrowed his eyes, instincts sharp. The rider slowed as he neared the ranch, his horse snorting, nostrils flaring. He dismounted with a smooth grace, boots striking the dirt with deliberate weight. His hat was tilted low, shadowing sharp features. But when he lifted his head, his eyes gleamed with the kind of charm that hid something rotten underneath. "Well now," the man drawled, his voice smooth as oil. "Didn't expect to find you so quickly, darling." Maren froze. Her breath caught, color draining from her face. Garrick saw it, the way her shoulders tightened, the way her hand instinctively reached behind her to touch Alora's arm. Her lips parted, and a single word slipped out, barely audible. "Asher." The name hung heavy, poisonous. Garrick's jaw tightened, his hand drifting near his belt though he did not yet touch the revolver there. "You know this man?" Garrick asked, his voice low but steady. Asher's smile widened, though it never touched his eyes. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Name's Asher Valen, and that's my wife standing right there." The words struck like a whip crack. Alora pressed closer to Maren, confusion flickering across her young face. Maren shook her head, her voice breaking through the silence. "That's a lie." "Lie." Asher's tone was almost playful, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "We never signed no papers, Maren. No annulment, no death record, nothing that frees you. You left me, but the law doesn't say you can." He took a step closer, boots grinding into the dirt. "And now I see you've found yourself a new home. A rancher's home. Convenient." Garrick moved forward, placing himself between them, his frame blocking Asher's path. His voice carried no heat, only the weight of iron. "You'll step back." For a moment, the air itself seemed to tighten. Asher smirked but raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, friend. No need for blood. Just came to collect what's mine." His gaze slid to Maren, lingering too long, his smile twisting. "And maybe what she's built since." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Maren's hands trembled where they gripped Alora's shoulders, but her eyes, storm gray and steady, held fast. "You're not my husband," she said, her voice low but clear. "The man I married died years ago. You're nothing but his brother." Asher's grin faltered for the first time, though only briefly. "Brothers, husbands, it all bleeds together out here. What matters is who's left standing." Rumors spread faster than wildfire in town. By dusk, whispers had tangled through every street and doorway. A widow who was not truly widowed. A man keeping another man's wife under his roof. A child born under uncertain blood. Garrick heard the talk when he went for supplies. Voices carrying from the general store, the saloon, the church steps. He was used to being judged, but the venom this time was different. It was pointed at Maren. When she ventured into town for thread, 3 women cornered her near the dry goods counter. their mouths pinched, their eyes sharp. "You bring shame here," one hissed. "Living with a man not your husband, lying to us, to your child." Maren stood tall, though her hands shook at her sides. "I thought he was dead. I buried him in my heart years ago." "That's not how the law sees it," another spat. "You should leave before your sin poisons the rest." Elora clutched her mother's dress, her small fists tight, her eyes wide with fear she didn't understand. Maren gathered her child close, refusing to let the tears fall until they were out of sight. That evening, Garrick found her at the pump, drawing water with her sleeves rolled, her hands raw from the rope. The setting sun caught the lines of strain across her face. He stepped beside her, took the bucket from her hands and set it down. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said quietly. Maren shook her head. "It's mine to bear. I made choices that led me here." Her eyes flicked toward the house, toward Elora's silhouette in the window. "But she doesn't deserve their cruelty." Garrick studied her, the fire in her eyes warring with exhaustion. He thought of his wife, of the silence that had followed her death, and knew this was not a burden Maren would outlast alone. "I'll find the truth," he said, his voice steady, "and I'll bring it back for all to see." The next morning he rode to the pastor's house. The Reverend answered the door, brows knit at the sight of Garrick's stern face. "I need records," Garrick said. "Church papers, enlistment logs, anything on Asher Valen. And on Eli Valen, too." The Reverend hesitated. "This is not..." Garrick's voice dropped lower. "She has nowhere else to go. I won't let lies ruin her. Give me the truth." By nightfall, the truth came, folded into a thin county registrar's letter. Eli Valen, Maren's husband, had indeed died in service, buried under a misfiled name after a border skirmish. Asher was his younger brother, a man who had returned bitter and broke, grasping at whatever he could twist into profit. He had no claim, no right, only deceit. When Garrick walked into the saloon that night, the room fell into hushed silence. Asher leaned against the bar, drink in hand, his smirk lazy until he saw Garrick's eyes. Garrick did not draw his gun. He did not raise his voice. He only stepped into the center of the room and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "You lied to this town. You called a widow a wife, a mother a liar. You'll get on your horse now, Asher, or I'll put you under it." Asher laughed once, sharp and ugly, but his laughter faded when Garrick's hand rested, slow and deliberate, near the buckle of his gun belt. The weight of the room shifted. Men turned away, women whispered, and no one moved to shield Asher. His smirk cracked, his eyes flicked to the door. He left. No one stopped him. When Garrick returned to the ranch, Maren stood on the porch, lantern light catching the tears she had not meant for him to see. Elora slept inside, safe, unaware of the storm that had nearly uprooted her world. Garrick stopped before Maren, the letter still folded in his hand. "It's over," he said. She shook her head faintly, her voice trembling. "It will never be over. People don't forget. They'll always look at me and see shame." He met her eyes, steady and unyielding. "Let them look. They don't get to write your story. You do." Her lips parted, but no words came. The distance between them was only inches, but it felt like a chasm neither dared cross. Yet in the quiet, in the raw ache of what they had endured, there was something undeniable. It was not peace. Not yet, but it was defiance. And it was fire, bright enough to burn through the lies that had tried to smother them. The morning after Asher's departure, the ranch was quiet in a way Garrick had not known before. It was not the silence of emptiness, nor the hush of suspicion that had weighed on them for weeks, but something gentler, almost hesitant. The storm of lies had passed, but in its wake lay a fragile calm, as though the land itself was waiting to see what would come next. Maren rose before dawn as always. She moved through the kitchen with practiced hands, stirring oats, slicing apples, feeding the fire. Elora shuffled in half asleep, her hair tangled from the night clutching her doll. Garrick watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, the light of the early fire flickering across his tired face. He had not slept much. The night had been filled with restless thoughts of the saloon, of Asher's shadowed grin, of the town's watching eyes. When Maren noticed him, she stilled for a heartbeat, then carried on with her work. She had not spoken much since the night before. The truth was out, but truth did not erase wounds. Elora glanced at Garrick with a shy smile, and he managed a nod. It was the child's simple trust that kept him steady. After breakfast, he saddled his horse and rode into town. though the weight in his chest told him it would not be a simple trip. The townsfolk were already gathered in knots outside the store and along the church steps. Their eyes followed him, not with the sharp suspicion of before, but with something quieter. Curiosity, unease, and maybe a flicker of respect. The blacksmith tipped his head. The preacher's wife gave a small nod. Gossip had lost its teeth, though Garrick knew it was not gone entirely. He stopped at the general store for flour and nails, but when he stepped back into the sun, he found a handful of neighbors waiting. One woman pressed a sack of dried beans into his hand without meeting his eyes. A man offered lumber for the broken barn beam. Their gestures were wordless, but Garrick understood. The tide was shifting, slow but certain. When he returned to the ranch, Maren was in the yard hanging linens. The wind tugged at the white sheets, snapping them like sails, and she fought them with determined hands. Garrick dismounted, carrying the sack and the lumber. She glanced at him once, her expression unreadable. "They've stopped spitting," he said quietly, setting the supplies down. She looked back at the fluttering cloth, her voice low. For now. He wanted to tell her it was enough, that she need not carry every whisper, but he saw the weight in her eyes and held his tongue. Instead, he stepped closer, took the corner of the linen she struggled with, and together they pinned it to the line. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment too long neither moved. Maren pulled her hand back, the faintest tremor in her breath. That evening Garrick sat by the fire, his shoulder aching from the day's work. Maren sat across from him, darning one of Alora's stockings. The child was asleep again, her soft breathing drifting through the room like a hymn. Garrick broke the silence first, his voice rougher than he intended. "My wife's name was May," he said. Maren looked up, startled. He had never spoken of her before. She was stubborn. Argued with me about everything, fence posts, horses, how much salt in the stew. But she was the heart of this place. When she died, the house died too. His gaze fell to the fire. "I thought it would stay that way." Maren's hand stilled over the fabric. The firelight painted her face in amber shadows. "You don't need to tell me this," she said softly. "I do," Garrick answered. His eyes lifted, meeting hers with steady weight. "Because I thought nothing could breathe life back into these walls. Then you came." For a moment neither moved. Maren's throat worked as if to speak, but no words came. She set the stocking aside and folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, forcing the tears back. "You've done more than you should for me," she said at last. "For us. I can't let you bear the scars of my past." Garrick leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Scars are just proof we survived. I've got mine. You've got yours. Maybe that's enough." The room fell quiet again, but the air was thick, charged with something both of them felt but neither dared name. 2 weeks passed. The ranch breathed easier, as though the land itself had accepted its new rhythm. Neighbors stopped by with small offerings, seeds, pies, even laughter. Alora played more freely, her giggles carrying across the yard. Maren moved through the house with a surer step, though she still carried the wariness of a woman who had lived too long waiting to be turned away. One morning, Garrick woke to the scent of roasting pork, of apples baking with cinnamon, of dill fresh from the garden. He stepped outside to find lanterns strung along the porch, tables carried out into the yard. Chairs were borrowed from neighbors, lined in long rows. Maren stood at the center, apron dusted with flour, her braid falling loose against her shoulder. Alora tied ribbons along the rail, humming as she worked. Garrick's chest tightened at the sight. By sundown, the yard was full. Neighbors filled the tables, voices mingling with the hum of fiddle strings played by the old ranch hand down the road. Children ran across the grass, laughter rising into the cooling air. Maren moved among them, pouring coffee, offering slices of pie, her smile hesitant at first but growing with each passing moment. Garrick stood in the center of it all, sleeves rolled, his arm finally free of its sling. For the first time in years, he let himself feel what it meant to host joy. As twilight painted the sky in layers of gold and rose, Garrick stepped forward. The talking quieted, eyes turned toward him. He looked at Maren, who stood near the porch with Alora at her side. His voice carried steady, strong, but not loud. "Maren Dusk," he said, "if you ever thought about cooking for someone for the rest of your life, I'd be proud if that someone was me." The crowd stirred, a low rumble of laughter and warmth, but all Garrick saw was her. Maren blinked, caught off guard, her lips parting, her eyes wide. Then slowly, her mouth curved into a smile. Open, free, and brighter than he had ever seen. She didn't answer with words. She simply reached out and took his hand, her fingers curling into his with quiet certainty. The crowd cheered, fiddles struck up again, and the night filled with light and sound. But for Garrick and Maren, the world had narrowed to the simple touch of joined hands, to the certainty that no whisper, no shadow, could undo what they had chosen. The next morning, before the sun crested the horizon, 5 shadows stretched long across the plains. Garrick rode at the front, Maren beside him, Elora perched proudly on her own small horse. Their figures moved together in the dawn, tethered not by law, not by blood, but by choice. The sky above them spread wide and endless, carrying both the weight of scars and the promise of healing. And in the quiet between hoofbeats, where the land held its breath, there was no longer just a rancher and a widow and her child. There was a family bound by fire that neither storm nor lie could ever smother.